So we were looking essentially at how the last deglaciation started, and we looked at CO2 changes and orbital changes. So we'll add a little bit more details, and this offers one very good example of how abrupt changes can happen in our system. So we'll spend a little bit of time looking at that. So we looked at vegetation changes from a lake sediment core, reconstructions of vegetation extent pushed down to lower latitudes during glaciation, and now they've all moved back up. And we also mentioned planktonic species. As the glaciation happens, cold waters come further down, and you can see this entire ocean is much cooler. So glacial plankton versus plankton today, the percentage difference is as high as 50, even in the deep tropics on the equator, which means the Hadley cell circulation, precipitation distribution, thermohaline circulation, everything would have changed. It's not just that upwelling changes, but if you remember the vertical profile, even the temperature that is coming up with the upwelling will change. So upwelling is always about bringing up waters, but also the temperature of the waters that are coming up. That can also change because you change the vertical structure.
So in planktons, are we talking about different species or same species?
Yes. Well, there are warm water species and there are cold water species. Cold water species prefer certain temperatures, so wherever the temperature occurs, they can shift, move down there. So if the amount of cold water species increase in the deep tropics, that means temperatures probably dropped by a lot. Right? That's how you think about it. So again, with upwelling also means the species distribution is also different in the vertical. There are lots of details about competing for light, competing for nutrients, and so on, which we won't get into. But here, just broadly speaking, these are surface species. So even in the Indian Ocean, the southern ocean circulation would have changed, the upwelling would have changed, even some equatorial signatures are there. But these are essentially limited by how many ocean sediment cores you have to analyze these kind of distribution. Okay, this is the Pacific Ocean distribution, again, the southern front and the Gulf of Alaska, the Kuroshio extension, and you can see here the Gulf Stream extension and so on and so forth. So entire circulation changes. And going back to the Southern Ocean, we know that the glaciers didn't disappear here, but when you cooled globally during the last glacial maximum, you increased the sea ice extent. Okay, this is the reconstruction from CliMap, which is the same group that did the sea surface temperature reconstruction. So this map is good to look at because, as we said, when glaciers build on the continent, there is glacier flow, so you get what is called shelf ice on the water. So as the glacier flows onto the water, that is called shelf ice. That's not necessarily sea ice. That's in fact not sea ice. It is a glacier that is flowing onto the ocean. Okay, so the winter sea ice in the modern times is pretty extensive, but because of this circulation and the heat exchange, this is not an closed, semi-enclosed body like the Arctic. So even in modern times, the winter sea ice in the Antarctic is not as thick as the Arctic, because Arctic is like almost like a lake and much fresher. It gets much thicker sea ice. Nonetheless, during the glacial time, the extent of the sea ice was remarkably much higher. As you can expect, cold waters, cold temperatures, air temperatures, so you will be losing lots of heat. Wherever you have sea ice, it acts as a very good insulator for the ocean. So once you form sea ice, then it's very hard for the ocean to lose more heat, right? It gets insulated from the atmosphere. But wherever it's open, the atmosphere can pick up hundreds, even 1,000 watts per meter squared of heat from the ocean. Because if the ocean water is not frozen, it's much warmer than typically the air. So wherever the air is much colder, ocean tends to lose huge amounts of heat. And that's how you begin to form the sea ice. So as we said, often you get pancake ice, but if the winter here is obviously on the continent, it can get to minus 50 degrees centigrade, which is very cold. So during the winter season, where you have 6 months of darkness, because you're beyond the polar circle, you can grow pretty thick ice, but still, because of the circulation, it will not be as thick as the Arctic. When we come back to global warming, then we have to think about what is the net consequence of ocean warming, for example. So you have to go back to, again, thinking about what would warm ocean do to the air temperature, the humidity, the snowfall, glacier growth, and so on and so forth, right? So warm ocean to first order would begin to affect the formation of sea ice or the shelf ice, the glaciers that are coming down. So often you will read news saying Laurentide ice sheet, or the big Larsen, not Laurentide, Larsen ice sheet broke off, a chunk as big as Rhode Island or New York broke off from the land, and so on and so forth. So those are direct heating effects of the ocean. But the ocean will also warm the air, increase the humidity, and increase snowfall on some parts of Antarctica. So when we look at Antarctica, we will see that some parts of Antarctica glaciers are actually growing, and in some parts they're actually melting, okay? Or the mass balance is negative. Ablation versus accretion. If ablation exceeds accretion, then you have net loss. So there's net loss of glaciers in some places, there's a net gain in some other places. So this is kind of the complication here compared to the Arctic, where Arctic is, if you're warming, you're essentially losing sea ice.
During glacial period, how do they estimate the extent of winter sea ice?
It again goes back to what is called ice rafted debris. So if ice had extended all the way here, it would be carrying some continental material. It would be manifest in the type of plankton species, etc., etc. So if you are blocking sunlight all the way here, you would have shifted the cold water species. So now the cold water species are here. So you can estimate that maybe there is sea ice over there, and the same thing over here. Okay, so you have to use combinations of multiple proxies to estimate the extent of sea ice. Okay, so we already talked about how CO2 and methane drop during the glaciation. There are several hypotheses. The first thing to remember is that if you have large glaciation and you have locking up a lot more ocean water as sea ice or glacier on continents, then you would be dropping sea level by a lot. Whenever you drop sea level, then the shelf area increases, right? So then the nutrient cycling increases. So you will change the biological production. So this is the kind of cartoon that's showing that. So if you build ice, you will have regional cooling, obviously, all around wherever you have glacier mass, and you have no change in the radiation. There is some precession forcing, but that's not the major change in amount of radiation being received. So you will bury a lot of organic matter. So wherever, for example, if the glaciers came all the way down to New York on North America, all the vegetation that was there, a lot of it will be pushed ahead into the ocean or on land, and a lot of it will be buried under. Plus, you will not be able to grow any more vegetation there. And if you have sea ice also extending, then you are also going to reduce, change biological production over there. But the story gets very complicated because when you have generally colder temperatures globally, what did we say about amount of rainfall? Will it increase or decrease globally? So globally, there will be a reduction in precipitation, which means generally there is increased dust concentration. So if you go and look at ice cores, we looked at one ice core example in the second chapter. During glacial times, the amount of dust in the ice cores is much higher, right? So generally the level of dust is higher and the winds are stronger because the equator to pole temperature gradient is also stronger. Okay, so reduced rain, increased dust, increased wind, so lush deposition was higher, for example. And dust also contains iron. Okay, generally there is some form of iron in the soil, and whenever you dump a lot of iron on the ocean, it's like a fertilizer. So photosynthesis increases. We'll see a little bit later on that there are regions where iron is a great limitation. Just like human body needs all the minerals and vitamins, the phytoplankton and other things that grow in the ocean also need all these macronutrients and micronutrients. Nitrogen, phosphorus are macronutrients, and iron and copper, zinc, there are many other micronutrients, but iron is one of the more important ones. So the general idea is that the dust deposition also increases. So you may be reducing production in some regions, but overall you will be increasing photosynthesis by iron deposition on the ocean. So the idea is that if there is a change of 80 to 100 parts per million in going from a deglacial to a glacial stage or a glacial stage to a deglacial stage, then you have to explain that, and usually multiple hypotheses are used: shelf area change, phosphorus supply change, iron deposition because of dust, and so on and so forth. In other words, we don't have a very clear idea of exactly what is the dominant process during the glacial-deglacial change of methane and carbon dioxide. Okay, that's something to remember. That's still a very open question, so you can, it's a good research problem. Descent of tropical mountain glaciers and forests. So obviously, as global temperatures cooled, you can imagine that the glaciers in the Alps and the Andes and the Himalayas and so on would have come much further down. So this is showing during the last glaciation, there was 600 to a kilometer extension of glaciers in some mountains. Along with that, the forest also would have shifted down, grasslands would have shifted down. So as you go from the foothills to the peak, the humidity and temperature begin to drop. And along with that, the species also begin to change. So you will have orographic rain. This is showing generally forest all around. But based on which direction the winds are coming from, if the winds are coming from this way, you will have more rain on this side and there will be a rain shadow on this side, right? Or this way, whatever. So in general, most mountains have a very strong rainy side and a dry side, a rain shadow, leeward side and windward side, right? So that's not shown here clearly, but nonetheless, the point is, with cooling, the mountain glaciers also would have come down. Mosquito levels would have, the level to which mosquitoes can go also would have come down. Many species change and so on. Under global warming, what we are looking at is, with global warming, as the warmer temperatures are going up, mosquito lines are going up, diseases are going up. Places like Burkina Faso, which were high enough that they didn't have a mosquito problem, for example, now are having mosquito problems. The other big thing is, if you have a certain species composition in a given piece of forest, the entire forest doesn't move. We are just saying here the forest moved up or down. Actually, only few species move, right? There are what are called mobile generalists and sedentary specialists. I don't know if you want to know the terminal. Generally, there are some species which are very mobile, So they can adjust very quickly to a new temperature level or humidity level, and they are more mobile. Whereas some are very, very niche. They are fixed to a place, they don't move. If the temperature changes in that place, they will just go extinct. So in a given combination of ecosystem where you have certain biodiversity, when ecosystems move, not every species will move. So you will have a new kind of forest. When you come down, it will be a different combination of species, and when it goes up, it will be a different combination. There will be some keystone species which may be anchoring the whole forest. For example, tropics have certain species. If this is the Himalayas, then you expect that tropical species would be still there, but the combination of species would be not necessarily the same. So those are the kind of details that you have to constantly look for when you are looking at climate change. You're changing everything: temperature, humidity, precipitation. You are not changing the length of day. For example, in the modern times, you're increasing CO2, which will affect photosynthesis. You're increasing temperature, humidity, rainfall. So the season of growing is increasing, length of growing season is increasing, but length of day is not increasing. So some species respond to that, some species don't. Okay? So let's now look at the radiation changes for during deglaciation, and this is since deglaciation. So if you remember, we are somewhere from 18 to about 6,000 years is when the deglaciation happened. So the melting started around 18,000 years ago, and by about 6,000 years ago, all the melting had been finished. So during that time, this increase in summer insolation was critical. This increase in CO2 was critical because this would have a positive feedback together with this. And this disappearance of glacier was important because this would reduce the albedo and increase energy trapped, and also have a positive feedback with this and this, right? So all together they are working in the same direction. Of course, this is related to this, and this is driving this, and so on and so forth. And after the melting of the glaciers 6,000 years ago, glacier had disappeared, then CO2 was relatively constant. The winter is getting warmer, so the deficit in radiation is decreasing, and the summer is getting cooler. Okay? So the precession forcing is very much acting. So you can think of this as a half cycle, right? 23,000 years. So you have basically, since the last deglaciation, you have a precession cycle happening. You had this cycle, and then you are going back. Is that clear? So all the processes are working together. So the net effect, if you look at the retreat of the North American ice sheets, the numbers here are thousands of years and the extent of the glacier. So about 14 to 18,000 years in the eastern seaboard, you had glacier coming much further south. In fact, you can now use your knowledge of the winds and the oceans to say why it would come much further down here and not here. That was a homework question, right? Should have been. Who can quickly say why on the eastern seaboard you have glaciers coming several hundred kilometers further south than? Yeah.
The warm waters are going towards the western seaboard, while here we have warm waters.
Is warm water going here from where? You have to do, huh?
From near the equator.
From near the equator, they are going north here. What circulation was that?
The direction of trade winds pushing the warm water towards the west, keeping the east side cooler because of the upwelling.
Okay. There are.
It goes even northeast. So taking heat away from
The In general, in the climate business, you want to just keep, let's say this is America here, and this is the Atlantic here, and this is the Pacific, right? And the equator is somewhere here. Okay, so trade winds are here, and westerlies are here, right? Equator is here. Where is the warm water coming up here? Which way was the circulation? If trade winds are here, huh?
Towards northeast.
Warm water is going towards northeast. Which current was that? Huh? Currents were doing this loop, and the subtropical gyre was doing this loop. I mean, the subpolar gyre was doing this loop. What current was here? With the huh? What? This is a very simple business. If you remember the temperature distributions and the winds like the back of your hand, then you can easily interpret everything else, right? It's not very complicated at all. We said warm currents go up on the western side of the ocean. If this is the Pacific, warm water is going up, cold water is coming down. But you have somehow warm water going up here. Huh? Grandma will run away from home, Kashi straight, never come back. Right? So winds, if westerlies are blowing this way, then this is feeling the continental climate, whereas this is feeling the maritime continent. Which will be milder climate, continental climate or maritime climate? Why? Why? Why would maritime continent be more moderate?
Because ocean waters don't heat up or cool down as much as the continent does.
Thank you. So always go back to third grade and remember heat capacity, right? Land, ocean. Ocean doesn't warm up or cool down rapidly, so you would expect more moderate climate on this side. If you think of California, Seattle versus Washington, D.C., Boston, who has more severe weather? Eastern seaboard, right? Because you are constantly getting continental climate. So you have maritime continent, which is not going to allow as severe changes here, as much cooling here, and this can get much colder. So you can see that this is clearly showing up. So even if you think about the ocean, you would expect that because winds are blowing on the ocean here for thousands of kilometers compared to here, you would expect higher waves, more surf. If you're a surfer, you would want to go to the west coast, not to the east coast. Okay? So something happened. So as the glacier was melting, something happened and there was a hiccup. So suddenly there was a refreezing of temperatures, and there was a rapid re-glaciation locally, not globally. So that is called younger Dryas. Okay, so you can see here this is showing depth in the core, so it's going from the current period back to about the last glacial, and this is showing polar species of planktonic foraminifera, which is a shell-forming plankton. And you can see the percentage of cold species began to decrease, and then suddenly it increased again. Around, this time is not shown here, but it happened around 12,000 years ago. Okay, so it's warming, cold species are beginning to disappear, there is a little hiccup, and then there is a huge hiccup. Okay, and you can see that here in terms of estimated summer temperature over England. It was very cold during the last glacial, began to warm, seemed to cool a little, and then suddenly there is a big jump. This happened very, very rapidly, which is referred to as abrupt climate change, and then it went back. So you can also see that in trees and so on and so forth. And you can see that here in terms of the polar front. So polar front was going back, and suddenly it jumped back during the Younger Dryas, and then it went back. Okay, so all the Younger Dryas moraines, the glacier pushed debris is there. This is called Younger Dryas basically because there is another older Dryas, little hiccup that happened here, and this is a major Dryas. Dryas is a flower. All right. So generally when I'm talking, it's good not to mumble. So the Dryas is a flower. It's a cold species, and it had disappeared because deglaciation had started and cold species had moved north. And when the sudden cooling happened, those cold species again appeared at lower latitudes. So now you can use your knowledge. When I ask questions, you can answer. What do you think could cause such a sudden refreeze? You have all the information you need, not just Younger Dryas. What could have caused this? Anybody? You're saying something.
Some fresh water was coming in. Somehow it affected the ocean, sorry, the springs that was coming. And I mean, this hot water.
Okay, so approximately right, but you have to put it together. Remember, it's like a movie. You have to tell the story properly. If hero dies first, then movie will be over. Unless there is a rebirth, which happens. Right? Who remembers? I said she's on the right track. She mentioned a few buzzwords which are keywords. If could be keywords if it's in the right sequence. Right? So the glaciers are melting. Some melt water is here. There is some kind of an ice dam on Lake Agassiz that is holding the fresh water back, and it breaks, suddenly releases lots of fresh water onto here, which would do what? Cool, and melt water would cool necessarily. What is the importance of melt water? Temperature or?
More precipitation.
More precipitation. Huh? Fresh water means salinity, right? If you put a lot of fresh water here, what would you expect? Salinity goes down, yes. Now that's 1 plus 0.5. Add another 0.5. What is the other 0.5? If deep water formation, what happens before deep water formation? Density change. Before density, how do you change density? Ice formation. We're talking about refreezing. So let's say we have melted here. Okay, so Younger Dryas is going from there to there. This is melted, it's open water now. Suddenly you put a lot of fresh water there. What are the steps? Fresh water means we already decided salinity is reduced. Easier to freeze. Okay, thermohaline will decrease, salinity reduced, thermohaline decrease immediately? Deep water formation will not happen because it's not heavy enough. What is causing the heaviness? What is? Evaporation is the key process, right? So if you evaporate, if you have very fresh water, it's not going, even if you leave salinity behind because it's so fresh, it cannot sink anymore. So as I said, there is 1 plus 0.25 plus 0.5 plus another 0.25. Somehow you have to push to 2, right? So you put a lot of fresh water, so you have winds, you have evaporation. Now the evaporation is not able to produce heavy water. And that's why you don't bring the warm waters anymore. So you have perturbed thermohaline circulation. This is exactly what happened in day after tomorrow, right? Day after tomorrow, initially they are saying there is 14 degrees warmer temperatures south of Greenland. And a few minutes later, everybody is in New York Library, frozen, having coffee and so on, right? So that is very critical. Why? Why is this important for global warming case? Again, 1 plus 0.1 plus 0.1 plus. Why is this important for global warming case? 1 person.
Increase in evaporation and therefore rainfall and precipitation that cools down the temperature and eventually raise.
This became 1 plus 66. Very short chain of what is happening under global warming in this region.
Is it frozen right now?
Is it? Huh? You are from Odisha. Where are you from?
Yeah, from Bombay.
Bhubaneswar. Bhubaneswar is frozen. This is also not frozen. Under global warming in this region, what is happening?
Water is coming from Greenland.
Huh? What is happening? Okay, at least Greenland was mentioned, so 1 plus 0.01 has happened. What is happening on Greenland? Glaciers are melting. So under global warming, we said that the feedback can be very fast. If Greenland melts a lot, then you can put lots of fresh water here. That's almost 1.9, which means you can perturb the thermohaline circulation, right? So that is why the two things that are important. One, in the warming phase, the feedbacks are very rapid. Glacier melts, albedo decreases, glacier melts more, and boom, you have abrupt change, right? And it's sitting right there where the deep water formation is happening in the Labrador Sea and the so-called Gin Seas, Greenland, Iceland, Norwegian seas. Hence, in global warming, we have to watch very carefully whether Greenland will melt enough to perturb the global thermohaline circulation. Younger Dryas gives you a very clear example that such feedbacks can happen on very rapid timescales. Okay, how rapid? You can see that when you look at very detailed ice accumulation record going back to about 10,000 years to about 16,000 years, you can see that within 100 years, within literally 10 years, you have big jumps happening. So the system has some very rapid, so this whole thing happened slowly up to about 1,000 years, and then there was a big jump, and suddenly it got stuck in that, and then it jumped back again. So this happened in 100 years, this happened in less than 100 years. Okay? So when you are doing global warming and when you are, so this is again showing that when you have freezing, you have more dust, drier climate and so on. So it's important because whenever you are kicking a system like the Earth's climate with global warming and glaciers are melting, you have to be aware of what are the fastest changes that can happen in the system, right? So Younger Dryas gives you a clear example of one of the fast feedbacks that exists. This also says that there are places in the world where the sensitivity is very high. If you dump a lot of fresh water here, not much will happen. If you dump a lot of fresh water here, not much will happen. But if you dump a lot of fresh water here, global consequences can happen, right? So you have to know where are the thresholds, where are the switches, where are the tipping points, what are the processes that can kick the system from one state into another state very rapidly. So that's the dominant theory that exists right now. There is a very clear evidence that such a fast change happened, and the idea is that that as these Great Lakes got formed by the glaciers carving out these huge holes in the ground that got filled with meltwater, Lake Agassiz, which is somewhere here, through the Hudson Bay, it dumped a lot of fresh water into the Labrador Sea, Jim Sea region. And there is some evidence that meltwater also went south, but nonetheless, some pulse of fresh water occurred here. So you can take a model and very easily do these sorts of experiments. The question is, how much fresh water do you need, and whether there was enough, bless you, whether there was enough fresh water being supplied by the melting of the glaciers, okay? So that's a good story to remember. So if you look at the sea level change, now you look at the sea level change, okay? Went from 120 meters below the modern sea level to about 30 meters below. So there is a change of 100 meters because of all that glacier melt over about 15,000 years. And the CO2 jumped from a minimum of about 180 or so to the pre-industrial level of about 270. So this is the 80 to 100 ppm change we get during glacial deglacial, which, as I said, has not been fully explained. Is it clear? So slowly you are bringing all the processes together. The idea of looking at all the winds and thermohaline circulation and oceans and monsoons, and we haven't looked at El Nino yet, but we will look at El Nino later on, is that all those processes are important at some time or the other. So you have to be able to pull them together. You cannot just randomly remember bits of information that don't add up, right? Okay. So the deglacial flooding lines. So this is again reconstruction. The land exposed when you built all this ice. So remember, this is almost 3 kilometers thick ice. It's heavy enough to sink the continent. So the continent under the ice would have sunk, and all the continent ahead of it would have risen. So the plate is flexible. So if you put a lot of weight here, this goes down and the one ahead goes up, and this melts. This begins to come up and this begins to sink. Okay? That is called isostatic adjustment. So that is a local adjustment, which means locally you are changing. It's like a styrofoam bobbing in water, or a ship. A ship is sitting there empty. You start putting containers on it, it slowly sinks, and relative to the hull, the sea level will go up, right? So that is called isostatic adjustment. Okay, so if this land sinks, then relatively the sea level would have gone up here, but because you have taken up all the water from the ocean, you would have exposed the Bering Strait, so you had a land bridge here, which likely played a role in migration of humans as well as animals and so on. So the origin of the natives that live here is now related to some people from Siberia, so probably some migrations happened. Remember, this lasted for about 100,000 years. And you can see that the coastlines were exposed everywhere. So you would have created much shallower pathways all along here. Okay, so you can see that you could have easily gone from China to Japan and so on and so forth. So you can see massive changes in the amount of land, that shelf area that you created. This is what changes the nutrient cycling, biological production, and migrations of various things. Okay, so once you melted it, all these, now this is Bering Strait, which is water. Obviously there is South China Sea, East Sea, the ocean here, and so on and so forth, right? Gulf of Carpentaria, or whatever this is. Okay, so if you look at then the effective moisture 9,000 years ago versus today, remember that as we are coming out of the glacial, we are rapidly increasing the summer insolation. So by 9,000 years, we are at about the peak of summer insolation, even though the winter is also at a minimum. In the deep tropics, winter is not a severe problem anyway, only at high latitudes that's a problem. So if you apply that to the moisture, 9,000 years ago, you can see that massive amounts of moisture was available, especially this region. This is all Gobi Desert and other regions over here. And this is the Sahara, Middle East, going down the drylands of grasslands of East Africa and so on and so forth, right? So we'll see that this time is known as the greening of Sahara, where there was much more rain. Lake Chad, many lakes here were quite full. And civilizations basically expanded from the Nile River to all parts of Sahara. As soon as water becomes available, civilizations grow, right? And you can see that this was the region of the Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, and so on and so forth. The Fertile Crescent region around Tigris River, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and so on. Agriculture expanded from around there, and so on and so forth. Even Japan was much more moist than today. You would expect that probably the Kuroshio was bringing much more warm waters to this area. So you can see the rapid change in climate going from very dry climate here to very wet climate here. So this is showing 9,000 years ago versus today. These are the observations. So you had much stronger monsoon circulation because you still had 9,000 years ago, the glacier had not completely disappeared yet. It disappeared only 6,000 years ago, which means the equator to pole temperature would have been stronger because the poles were still colder. There are still glaciers, much larger glaciers than today. So you would have stronger monsoonal circulation. So the African region was, you can see here, this is in C14 years, North African lake levels around 9,000 to about 6,000 years ago, they peaked, and now they have almost completely disappeared, right? And this is showing simulations of model moisture surplus. Models, it's very hard to run them continuously because this is thousands of years. So what they do is just run periods, run for this period, and so on, and see if you can produce the change in moisture supply consistent with observations. You give models the orbital forcing, continents, mountains, and so on and so forth.
So if there was increased precipitation in the particular latitude where we have the deserts today, does that mean that the ITCZ and the polar side of the ITCZ had shifted accordingly?
Yes, every time you shift the monsoons, we'll see maybe one figure of the so-called global monsoons, but if you remember the ITCZ is, every time you change trade winds, the convergence zone is going to shift, which is the ITCZ, right? So as long as you are still in the tropics, subtropics, it is directly related to the ITCZ. But if you're talking about rainfall over there, then that's not so directly related, because we'll see that this one is related to the westerlies. You're still here in the trade wind region, right?
But that's quite a spread. I mean, quite a longitudinal spread, right? So that entire
This is moisture. This is moisture, not rain. Okay. Remember, evaporation happens on large. This is kind of a fundamental thing in ocean and atmosphere, and even in the lab. If you take a, let's say, a tank like this, and you have water, if you put a heat source here, let's say you're putting heat, this water will get lighter and it will start to move. So you will have water rising, right? The scale selection happens in such a way that the sinking happens in a very narrow region and the rising motion happens on a very broad region, even though the heating is very concentrated. So the analog of that in the ocean and the atmosphere is that ITCZ is a very narrow rising region, but the sinking happens over a very, very, very large region. Okay, rising is actually going against the gravity, sinking is with gravity, but still rising happens on very narrow region, and in the ocean also you have deep water formation in very small places, and the rising motion is everywhere. There are nice fluid dynamic works that show why this happens, but it's a very interesting process that is there everywhere. So in that sense, if you remember, your ITCZ and subtropics are all evaporating. Evaporative regions are supplying moisture to rain so much. Right? Now when it rains over India, evaporation is happening all over the Indian Ocean and also over the Ganga basin and so on and so forth. So moisture is not necessarily the rain. This is what is the excess moisture in the atmosphere that is being supplied to the convergence zone. Okay.
The rainfall is still limited to the narrow zone that you're talking about.
Well, the width of the ITCZ would have changed, but not this much. There is much more rain in general. So ITCZ is the concentrated rain, and then around that you have rain, let's say, for 500 kilometers or something like this. So you would have had more rain, but then the hydrologic structures, what matters is the lake levels. People don't necessarily rely just on rain. They also, if there's a river or a lake, they go around the lakes and the rivers, right? So the hydrology integrates the rain and puts it into one place.
But the similar situation exists today also, right? Even though the ITCZ is a line and there's only rainfall along that, we should have amount of moisture available for whatever consumption or wildlife or forest for a greater spread, like it did 9,000 years back. Why isn't that the case today?
Well, because the background humidity here is now, this is compared to today. So this was much greater than today, which means today is much less.
Is evaporation happening there today?
Well, there's no water, there's nothing to evaporate over Sahara, there's no water, right? So the Hadley cell is sinking. The way to think about it is the Hadley cell, right? There's a lot of sinking motion here, which means there's no moisture. Air is coming down, it's dry, right? Air above is dry, it comes down. So you have large sinking motion over here, whereas during that time, you would have shifted it such that you would have expanded the conversion zone and the sinking would have happened here. There's much less moisture here.
For a piece of land to get moisture or rainfall, it needs to have its own localized water bodies as well as peripheral oceans, not just the peripheral oceans.
No, I'm talking about sinking.
Yes.
So wherever, if air is, for example, here air is not sinking means it's converging. So it will be bringing water from, let's say, here. So it's bringing from, local water is not that much. If you imagine India, it's getting 900 millimeters of rain. Out of that, almost.
Lakes and rivers.
Huh?
Cannot be lakes and rivers.
Yeah, it has to be almost all from the ocean. So same thing here. Okay, so this is the signatures from the ocean. So monsoon over India also, you can see 20,000 years ago, this is showing the depth of the core and the upwelling species here. Remember we said when this jet gets stronger, we had downwelling on this side and upwelling on that side. But the coastal upwelling is directly related to the strength of the winds. So as long as they are looking at the coastal species, the upwelling species, then you can be confident of the interpretation. So during glacial maximum, upwelling species, which means what? Upwelling brings much colder water, many more nutrients. So you'll have different species than the species that grow when the upwelling is much weaker. The upwelling species increased, peaked around 9,000 years ago, and then have decreased now to this level. So the monsoon that is now at present is much weaker than the peak monsoon we had about 9,000 years ago. Okay? So this would have obviously helped the growth of agriculture and so on and so forth along the way, right? So if you look at the vegetation-precipitation feedback in North Africa, I briefly mentioned this before. So right now, if you remember that this is very, very dry, and there is a region here called Sahel. So you have ITCZ, Congo, Zaire, this place is famous for its rainforests, right? Then as you go north, you get what is called Sahel, where you have grasslands and so on. To the north of that, you have Sahara, which is just complete desert, right? So since the 1940s or so to about the 1980s or even 1990s, the rainfall here kept getting reduced even further. Even if it's a desert, for example, in Rajasthan, you still get 200 millimeters of rain. If you ask Rajasthanis, that's a lot of water. You can collect it and they can do a lot of things with 200 millimeters of water. Whereas in Chennai, it's 1000 millimeter, but they are struggling because she's convinced that there is a problem, right? You think Chennai needs to get more water. Tankers, right? So there was a very nice paper by Jules Charney, who is a very famous meteorologist who was at MIT for a long time. He had a nice paper arguing that there is something called a biological feedback. If you have vegetation, it will create evapotranspiration, local microclimate, and rainfall will increase. If you deforest or reduce vegetation, then you will reduce rainfall and it will be a positive feedback. This became a big excuse to blame the Africans, saying that they are grazing too many animals, they are destroying the forests, and that is what is reducing the rainfall, and that is what is expanding the desert, and so on and so forth. Only in about, 1990, I'm very emotional about this. Only in about 1994, a nice paper came out from Columbia University showing that the rainfall decrease is actually directly related to the ocean warming that happened here. And that ocean warming was directly related to the pollution from US and Europe. Okay? So that's why these things are very important to understand what are the kinds of feedbacks you have. There is no question that deforestation is bad, but the nomads which are grazing animals, they have been doing that for many generations, right? Rainfall happened in the last 50 years. Of course, population has increased and so on, but not the nomads. Nomads haven't increased in population by that much, and so on and so forth. So there is always this battle between explaining the changes and who to blame, right? So obviously over India and Pakistan and so on, deforestation is a big player. So when you look at past changes, then you have to look at what are the feedbacks. So here you can use the model to say, to produce the distribution of modern summer rains without having any feedback from soil moisture and vegetation, you will get certain amount of rain. But when you add the soil and vegetation feedback and insolation and so on, you can see that the monsoon gets much stronger. So this is how you would do attribution. In other words, to explain the increased monsoon around 9,000 years ago, you take the land-ocean configuration, you add insolation forcing, which gives you additional land heating, summer insolation is increasing, you add soil moisture feedback, which means what? If the soil is very dry, when it rains, it doesn't necessarily have local evaporative feedback. But as rain begins to put more and more moisture, for example, irrigation. Irrigation puts lots of water. Now people are trying to figure out whether irrigation is increasing the monsoon or decreasing the monsoon. There are still contradictory answers from models, but nonetheless, you expect that evaporation from land is going to play a role in the not only land-ocean heating contrast, but also local energy feedbacks, and so on and so forth. So this is a nice example to show that to explain the increased monsoon or changes in monsoon, you always need the soil and vegetation feedback. And a nice paper came out just last year, I think, my IIT Bombay student, which showed that Western Ghats vegetation is responsible for almost 30 to 40% of the summer rain over Tamil Nadu, for example. So if you deforest Western Ghats, you are actually going to reduce rainfall over Tamil Nadu, okay, and so on. So those kind of feedbacks have to be kept. So to look at the future trends in summer insolation, these are easily calculated using the Milankovitch formulas. So we are here today. 50,000 years ago, we already knew what the precession changes have happened. 10,000 years ago, we peaked in the 65 knots summer insolation because the precession index and the tilt were in the same direction. And today, we had certain tilt contribution and precession is at a minimum. And 10,000 years from now, the tilt and precession will be in opposite phase compared to what happened here. So you will get a minimum and so on and so forth. So essentially this means going from today, should we be going into a ice age or not in the next 10,000 years, and whether global warming is actually going to change the ice age cycles naturally, that would naturally occur, and so on. And then 20,000 into the future, 20,000 years into the future, you will again get the maximum from the tilt, etc., etc. Okay, so these are easily calculated. So now the question is to watch in the next 100, 200 years whether our force, the greenhouse forcing, is going to be more than dominating the orbital forcings, okay, which have been giving us the natural cycle. So going back to this figure then, remembering everything you learned, we had one major tectonic cause we invoked here, the Himalayan mountain building and drawdown of the CO2, and because of the monsoon and warming and a lot of weathering of the new mountains. Before that, we had the Eocene optimum. We mentioned Paleocene thermal maximum. We talked about the Cretaceous hothouse, and we said there was a change of time scale going from 41,000 years to 100,000 years. We don't have a very clear explanation as to exactly why that happened. There are many theories, some convincing, some more convincing than the others, and so on. But nonetheless, there is this Pliocene and Pleistocene. Pleistocene is the last couple of million years where the 100,000 year cycle kicked in. That's also important because that's where our ancestors evolved from gorillas, chimpanzees, and our relatives. And we'll see that Pliocene was a very different climate compared to the Pleistocene in terms of the mean temperatures in the Pacific Ocean. So there is a change here also over East Africa, which probably played a very critical role in the evolution of the human beings. There are lots of other stories here. Miocene has some 6 million years ago. If you go and dig a core in the Mediterranean, you get a mountain of salt. Okay, that's called the Miocene something hypothesis or the other. Basically, right now, if you think about the Mediterranean Sea, it's a regional sea. Atlantic water is coming in, Mediterranean water is going out. In most estuaries, ocean water is heavier. So it tends to come in at the bottom, and the estuarine water, which is lighter, tends to go out. Whereas the Mediterranean evaporates so much every year that it forms very heavy water inside. it forms local bottom water in the Adriatic Sea and so on. So Mediterranean water is going at the bottom and the Atlantic water is coming on top. Right? Anybody know what is the channel that allows Atlantic water to come in and Mediterranean water to go out? The Strait of Gibraltar. Do you know how wide it is? 10 meters? You can stand here and throw a stone or throw an African and they will land in Portugal, right? So it's like 40, 50 kilometers or whatever, and it's pretty shallow. So right now, if Mediterranean is evaporating, then that is not losing water because the Atlantic water can keep coming in. At some point, if you close the Gibraltar somehow, change the sea level and prevented the Atlantic water from coming in, then the Mediterranean would keep evaporating and keep putting a lot of salts at the bottom. So 6 million years ago, there is a huge mountain of salt that is related to somehow the change in circulation of the Mediterranean. And so
also explain the formation of Dead Sea.
Of Dead Sea?
It's very saline.
Dead Sea has lost all of its hydrologic structure, so there is no water coming in. It's losing, I don't know, a meter per year or something. So it has been concentrating salt for a very long time. It's not 6 million years, it's much more recent. Okay, that's mostly to do with other human problems. So we finished the deglacial, glacial. The main point to remember there is that deglaciation, the last one that we focused on, is triggered by orbital forcing. The melting of glacier didn't occur monotonically. So we had, for example, the younger Dryas, which recooled suddenly around 12,000 years ago. Meltwater pulses perturb the ocean thermohaline circulation. This is important in the global warming context because we are in a deglaciation phase and the Greenland is melting pretty fast. We'll look at that later on when we look at modern climate change. And global cooling, initiated about 50 million years ago, is riding on top of this. That is still going on. But the rate of warming we have created since Industrial Revolution is quite fast compared to the cooling that's happening over 50 million years. And the question now is, how will the initiation of the next ice age because of orbital forcing be affected by global warming, right? So global warming, at least this gives you a sense that the idea of looking at past climates is that we want to understand what potential solutions are there in the system that will help us understand what we are doing. Right now, we are just producing carbon dioxide, we are perturbing the climate, and we are doing deforestation and so on. And we have no idea what it means in terms of the sensitivity of our climate system to all these kinds of perturbations. Okay? Are there any questions? These are short chapters. I've basically reduced them in length to make only few points because we can then spend more time on historical and modern climate change and future projections. But I've also added a chapter on monsoon and El Nino, which will be probably will go slower because the way things have gone so far in terms of adding meltwater and salinity and so on, and whether the North Atlantic is frozen or not. Are there any questions? You don't need to be afraid of asking questions. You can ask any questions, whether North Atlantic is frozen or idli this morning was good or not. How many of you had idli here this morning? It was horrible, wasn't it? It was like a paleoclimate idli. All right. If there are no questions, we'll look at another aspect of timescale in the system, which again remains basically unexplained. So I'll show one or two hypotheses that have been proposed to explain them. But what is clear is that from observations, this time scale exists. They are called millennial oscillation. Millennium is what? 1,000 years. So millennial means multi-thousand year cycles. So this is showing data from ice cores in Greenland, and this is the dust content. Again, remember there is a very clear signature of the younger Dryas, for example, and this is the depth of the ice core, so not necessarily time. So every time you freeze, you increase the wind speed, you reduce the rainfall, you increase the dust, and you increase dust concentration in ice cores, which can easily be measured as conductivity, for example. They just run an electrode on the ice core, and then it shows these kind of spikes where dust concentration changes. And we have delta O18, which we know when it gets more depleted, it means warmer or colder? Sure? Just look at these two and then say. So which delta O18 are we looking at? Huh? Depleted is cold. And if you look at the ocean, right? At least one person remembered. So here we are looking at ice cores. This is why depleted means cold. You will keep increasing O16 in the ice core and reduce O18, which means if you look at sediment core in the ocean, then O18 will increase during cold periods and decrease during warm periods. So you have to remember those things. So this is showing now a ocean sediment core, North Atlantic sediment core, and now you can see the number of polar species in there and Greenland delta O18. Basically the point these few graphs make is that there are evidences from all over the world, even on land, in the ice, on the ocean. So this is showing now, this was in the North Atlantic, Greenland. This is showing somewhere in Europe. This is again ice core, European soil properties, pollen, in other words, vegetation species, which correspond to changes in temperature. This is showing west coast of the US, so very far away from there, very different climate regime. And it's also showing the species of ocean plankton that correspond to, this is the Santa Barbara Basin sediment. Everyone has these multiple thousand year time scales in them, okay? So we have been looking at precession time scale, we've been looking at ellipticity modulated precession and obliquity time scales of 23,000 and 41,000 years. And then we said we have a 100,000 year time scale, which is not very well explained. And now we are saying there is another 1,000 year time scale. Where would it come from? Because it's not in the orbital forcing, right? Orbital forcings are at 23,000 and 41,000 and 100,000. This is producing a much higher frequency, right? One of the things we said in the 100,000 is that when you looked carefully at the 100,000 year time scale, within that there was a 23 and a 41,000 year time scales, but the peaks were somehow at 100,000 year time scales. So when you have all these multiple time scales together, and you have lots of internal feedbacks like the thermohaline circulation, monsoon change, El Nino change, and so on, obviously you can produce this kind of frequencies. There are lots of processes which can have resonance within internal feedbacks and so on and so forth. So that will be the main point of this chapter. This is now showing Antarctica, okay? And this is the methane signature, and this is the delta O18 signature. Again, multi-thousand year millennial time scales, very clearly seen. This question also is very important. If you see some time scale in the northern hemisphere and some time scale in the southern hemisphere, then always the question is, how is the communication happening across the equator? Is it through the ocean or is it through the atmosphere? Where is the cross-equatorial atmospheric circulation happening? It's the Hadley cell and the ITCZ, right? ITCZ is moving energy, we said, across the equator. But in the ocean, you have meridional overturning circulation or the thermohaline circulation, which is clearly moving energy across the equator, right? So you have to know whether atmosphere can do it or ocean can do it. Atmosphere is very low density, very low heat capacity fluid. If you imagine timescales, for example, do you think atmosphere can have a 1,000-year timescale at all? Very hard to imagine, right? It has no memory. Basically, very low heat capacity means it has no memory, like land, right? So atmosphere cannot have very low frequency, but when ocean forces a timescale, then atmosphere can keep acting on those timescales as well as response to the ocean, right? So it's most likely going to be the ocean, but it's a very critical question. It's not always very well understood what communicates the climate change signals across the hemisphere. There are few candidates, but that's about it. Okay? Yeah.
So Hadley cells don't cross the equator. They go in the opposite directions from the ITCZ.
Where is the ITCZ?
I mean, so
Why do we call it intertropical convergence zone?
yes. I mean, when I'm saying equator, I have ITCZ in mind. That what I'm saying is, you're not really taking heat from the northern hemisphere and putting it to lower latitudes in the southern hemisphere, because there is ITCZ. So you go in, you diverge from ITCZ.
Is there cross-equatorial flow in the ITCZ, in the Hadley cell or not?
There is cross equator, but there is no cross ITCZ. That's what I'm saying.
It's ITCZ, that's why that's where convergence is happening.
Yes.
But it's not a continuous feature. For example, monsoon is going across the ITCZ, right? The main point is, are you able to cross the equator in the atmosphere or not? Obviously, Hadley cell is across the equator. So if you remember what we said, those details you probably don't remember because you're having trouble remembering even simpler things. But if there is rising motion and wind is coming from the subtropics, it is colder here and warmer here. We already said that if you just look at heat, at least, and then you are going this way, right? So it's very cold here. As you raise the air and you rain, actually, if you look at temperatures in the atmosphere here, it's colder here than here. Okay, because you're raising the air, condensing and losing all cloud top temperatures here are very cold. Okay, so you're moving heat from a colder place to a warmer place. Okay, and this is not necessarily on the equator. This is moving with season, right? So only when you add humidity, so you have to take total moist static energy. We didn't get into all this. So it's not just heat, but you have to take humidity plus this term is small anyway, and the kinetic energy is small. So it's the humidity that gives you net transport energy, poleward energy transport by the Hadley cell. Okay, but what else did we say? If we look at the thermohaline circulation, in the Atlantic Ocean is moving heat to the north. The southern hemisphere is in fact cold compared to the northern, colder. So you're moving heat again from the colder hemisphere to the warmer hemisphere in the ocean.
That is to the ocean.
Yeah, so you have to bring the heat energy back somewhere. You cannot keep moving energy north. Who's bringing the energy south? ITCZ is doing the energy transport south. Okay, so that's why we said this is called the energy equator. Okay, this matters because when we say on long time scales thermohaline circulation changes, that means energy transports are also changing. So there are many ways to look at these things. They're all related. We are not always making energy arguments because we're focusing mostly on circulation Hadley cell, ITCZ. So, but you have to keep in mind that that's also related to energy. Okay, so Hadley cell does do cross-equatorial flow, cross-equatorial energy, and in the zonal mean sense. So ITCZ is across the globe and so on. Okay, so this is Antarctic methane and delta O18. Again, there are millennial signatures that are synchronized with the northern hemisphere. That also has to be explained. How is that north and south are synchronized on these time scales? So these are more and more evidences. This is more like a 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 year time scale signature. And Jared Bond found from Columbia University found that there is a 1,500 year time scale that's called now the Bond cycle. And there was conjecture that maybe that's a cycle in the ice rafting in the North Atlantic, which could be Antarctic ice or glaciers from Greenland. Okay, so you have to just track these things. What are the hypotheses? Are there any millennial scale changes in sun strength? If you look at the C14 production, so we said, when we said C14 is an age tracer, we said there is constant bombardment of nitrogen by cosmic rays, and the constant background concentration of C14 is approximately constant, and that is why we can date C14 in the ocean and so on, or in organic matter as it decays, because we can compare it to a standard. But actually it turns out that C14 production also has some variability because sun strength itself is not constant, sunspots and other things. So there is the estimated C14 production change. So weaker sun, stronger sun, the C14 changes. If you make a filtered time series, these are two estimates, you can see that delta C14 has varied by a small amount over this time. It turns out that this is not enough to explain the radiative forcing associated with these, is not enough to explain the millennial timescale in the climate records. So that just means we still don't know. Then there are...
If we use, say, the Mundane minimum, as you're saying, the sunspots are affecting the radiation. So if we have any observations regarding C14, which correspond to a long period where there were no sunspots, can we say if the radiation is actually affecting the C14 production?
Yeah, that's how this is done.
So they have also taken account of that long period without sunspots and it's matching?
Yeah, this calculation is done by using sunspots and other heliophysics calculations. So it obviously has to match, otherwise there's no point doing that, right? So this calculation is related to, you can see there's a question mark, so there are uncertainties in it, but it's a reconstruction of ages determined by counting individual tree rings that can be compared against ages determined by C14 analysis. So you calibrate it against another proxy, like the tree ring, to see whether, so you can see that there is a shift here and the peaks are not of the same magnitude, amplitude, so, but the time scales match. Okay, so there are uncertainties in these things, but the main point is there is enough, you can say enough that this forcing of solar variability doesn't explain millennial timescales. that we see in the system. Okay, there are more exotic explanations like this one, where it's showing that you are building a glacier on land, you are near an ocean. So there is a bedrock pinning point, which means beyond this, there is floating shelf ice, like in Antarctica, for example. So where there is maximum glacier, the land is going to sink. But this now becomes more vulnerable to changes in ocean temperatures, right? So if this shelf ice melts away, then you're going to reduce the pressure on the land. So remember that when this is pushed down, this is pushed up. So if you reduce this, that's going to go back down. So this is going to rise, this is going to sink. So then ocean water is going to get more under and begin to shift the pinning point and jump back to the next topography point, pinning point, and so on. So you can see that this kind of process is obviously possible and it can be observed that it has happened, but you have to explain the time scale. Why does this give you 1,000-year time scale? That's not always very easy, right? You can hypothesize based on observations or based on theory, but maybe you can build a model like this. But then you have to adjust the depths, the heat contents, background temperatures, circulations, everything. And then you have to find an example where that matches, okay? Plus, they have to be global. So remember, we are saying the argument we are making is that we can find these in many, many places, whereas this is a very local process, right? Time scales have to be explained and spatial scales have to be explained. That's not very easy, okay? So nonetheless, these are called natural oscillations at ice margins. This definitely happens, but doesn't necessarily explain all the millennial oscillations that are seen. I'll stop here. This is, again, we'll come back and try to conclude tomorrow.